Why are there Christians living in the Gaza Strip? If you are anti-Zionism, are you also an anti-Semite? And is profit inherently exploitation? We'll discuss these takes and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds and the internet and find takes that we're interested in, and we discuss whether we think they are good or bad. My name is Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So we've got a quote retweet from a couple users. So Michael Eisen, I don't know if we can share his name or not, but he originally writes, I have been informed that I am being replaced as the editor-in-chief of eLife for retweeting an Onion piece that calls out indifference to the lives of Palestinian civilians. And then a Twitter user retweets them and says, nothing anyone says will ever be measured, quantified, or even handed enough for people making demands of you. There's no perfect set of words that will save anyone from this stuff because it's not about that. No one's offended. They just want you to be afraid. I'm assuming we're going after their quote retweet.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, the quote retweet here I think is completely correct and absolutely right. It's one of those things where there's two sides to this kind of point of view, which is, you know, they're canceling me for speaking the truth. A lot of the times people will be obnoxious, right? They'll say something totally provocative, unhelpful, and then the consequences of those actions are being fired or let go or reprimanded, and then they run to this like, oh, it's the cancel culture, it's the mob, and then people generally on the left will say, oh, that's not cancel culture, that's consequence culture. Like you can't just pretend like, oh man, woe is me. But the reality is that I think what this take is correct in is that the reasonable cases where you are saying something that isn't controversial, it's not over the line. If they want to get you, they will get you. It's not a matter of every time someone has the mob come after them, they get fired. It's not a case of every time it's a symptom of cancel culture, but it is a time of every time they want to find something on you, they will find something on you. And it does not matter what it is. And so I'm really tired of this sort of straw man about like cancel culture doesn't exist. And anyone who's ever claiming it and saying they're canceling me for speaking the truth or whatever, they're just using hyperbole so they can say slurs or so they can, just say things that are mean and inoffensive. It's not always the case, because there are cases like this where basically all he did was retweet an article that wasn't even the most extreme we've seen on either side of this kind of conversation. But the point is that person took one step out of line and boom, they're coming for him, canceling him. And there's no groveling that he could do. There's nothing he will do to get his job back. It doesn't matter if he, supported all the Zionist policies in the world. If you step out of line, it's less about you did something to hurt someone and more about you did something that was outside of the purview we have set for you, and now you're compromised. No matter what you do, you've shown you will step outside of the bounds that we have, that we view as acceptable, and knowing that you can go rogue is enough for them to want to sort of, shoot you off to the side and leave you in the dust.
Yeah, this reminds me of several things. One of the most recent ones is a guy named Douglas Mackey spread an internet meme during the 2016 elections that made the classic joke of like, hey, if you're a Republican, voting's on Tuesday. If you're a Democrat, vote by, your text message on Wednesday or whatever it is. And making the joke basically like, don't vote on Tuesday if you're a Democrat because I don't want you to vote at all. And he just got sentenced. I don't recall to how many years in jail, but found guilty of election misinformation enough to be sentenced to jail. And you can look on the internet. It doesn't take long to find Democrats and people in power or people that are on the side of the popular or the elites posting the same thing. And it's not that they actually care about the principle of, oh, like you were injecting some unfairness into the election or we need to protect our democracy or anything like that. It's that, oh no, someone did something. They discovered some sort of power that was kind of funny, but also had a very powerful outcome. And we need to make an example of them to make everyone afraid of continuing to do that. And we only want people that we approve of to be doing that. And this is one of the things that the left doesn't understand is that, and I mean, I guess this is the thing that the right didn't understand back in the early 2000s, which is all of the mechanisms that they weaponized and that they were warned about weaponizing have now been turned against them. All the surveillance state, the deep state, all these bad actors that we call out as like, oh, the deep state are bad. We were not we, but the Republicans were cheering on for years, much to the chagrin of libertarians and the left. And it's been really unfortunate to me to see, this Ukraine and Israel conflict, because it's like, man, like basically there is no anti-war side anymore. It used to be that whoever was not in power, who didn't have the dominant cultural hand, was the anti-war side, which was nice, and so you could kind of count on that. But now both sides kind of get their druthers, and now we have people that are angry about everything and can justify everything and have some sort of baton to beat the other into submission. The other aspect that's always been interesting to me is that like this coalition of the left that is that you can kind of count on being on the same side about things like intersectionality, about trans rights, about socialism and Medicare for all and all these different things. Like the same people that kind of dictate what they are supposed to support there were also able to dictate that they were supposed to support the Ukraine war. Like it was a really weird, like follow the herd peer pressure kind of thing. It had nothing in relation to any of their other social principles. In fact, it probably was contrary to a lot of their social principles. But you would see these same people that were advocating for that also being reliably counted on to put the Ukrainian flag into their bio or whatever. And it's the same thing with like this Israel thing, but just on the right. And it's just really sad that's like, okay, yeah, groupthink really just exists as a mechanism of hurting the individual that dares challenge, the current conventional thinking that's going on. And we see this Michael Eisen is not the first, nor is he going to be the last. I think about the guy who was the executive, I believe, at T-Mobile, who someone dug up because they didn't like him. They dug up that he had donated like $500 to a pro-life organization like 10 years ago, and they were able to create enough of a stink about it that T-Mobile ended up firing him. So, yeah, the antidote to this is for everyone to just be more informed and to think through their principles.
Right. And at a certain point, I think the response is for the things where it matters most, like organizations and platforms and things. If that's where you're getting cut off, it's incumbent upon the counterculture, the people who don't want to be absorbed into this monolith of right think, not political left or right, just correct think, to build our own platforms, to build our own things. And yes, they will always get invaded by mind rot, and you always have to be vigilant and fight that off as long as you can. And maybe we have to keep building new things because they get taken and decayed. But I think that we can't just assume this thing that, like think about, for instance, business used to be seen as sort of this conservative, I don't know, entity, maybe, right? Like, oh, the business vote will go to the Republican and stuff. And as time has gone on, not only is this not true from actual conservative values position, with, like lobbyists and crony capitalism and things like that and corporatism. But moreover, you look at the articles, and I think it's in the last year, or I don't remember what the exact time frame is, but recently, I think it was in 2022, 94% of S&P 500 hires were minorities. 6% were white. Now, I'm not saying that they have to hire white people in order to be conservative, but when you see a statistic that overwhelmingly in favor of minority, then you should know that something's going on in what was, again, considered a conservative entity. So I think we need to stop this idea that, thing like, conservatives or common sense or people who deal with reality every day, like, that's not what many of these institutions and frameworks and even businesses we've built, that's not where they are today. And so it's incumbent upon us to build new things, to build new platforms, to build new, build our own things so that when they want to silence you, when they want to pull the plug, you have somewhere to go. And we don't just cede all of this power to the woke scolds, I think.
Agree with you there. Let's move on to our next one. We got Scott Horton quote retweeting someone. The first person writes, I accept the given that there are Christians in Palestine. I ask what draws someone to want to be in such a place while Hamas uses them as human shields? Is there no other place they could be? With Hamas in the area, why would anyone who wants to live peacefully keep living there? Oh boy. Scott Horton quote retweets this and replies, one, they are all prisoners there. They cannot leave. And two, they don't want to leave because it's what's left of their land. And three, you might have noticed it's the Israelis slaughtering them. You do not have to just turn the truth inside out because the TV told you to. What do you think about what Scott Horton is saying here?
It's funny. I had a conversation somewhat recently about this because I talked about Justin Amash, who had family who died in the church bombing because he's a Palestinian American. And I posted that this was tragic. And there was pushback. And someone was talking about, they thought that the post was fake. They didn't know who Amash was. And I was like, dude, like, why would you think that? And like, of all people, this is probably the one person you can trust on this kind of issue, considering, he was in Congress for what, like 6 years and missed, I think, maybe one or two votes ever, and posted his reason for every single vote ever. Like, this is the one guy who's been transparent about everything. It's ridiculous. And then it just felt like this person's like, well, I just am skeptical because if you're a representative and your family's over there, why wouldn't they leave? Like, why wouldn't you have the resources to get them to come out? And it's like, there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. But I think Scott lays it out perfectly. Like, there's a risk, regardless of your connections, to leaving. Like, that's risky to physically do. It's also risky to leave everything behind just in general. That's hard. It's really easy in principle to say that, but it's not an easy thing to just pick up and do. And then, similarly, you shouldn't have to just pick that up because there are terrorists. Now, I'm not saying that you should hold on to your piece of land amidst everything, or I'm not even saying that, the risk isn't great enough that it warranted it. But it's just like one of those things where when you're talking about, like, hey, the Israeli response is hurting and targeting civilians to some degree, and they're getting hurt, your first response shouldn't be, well, they need to move out of the way. That'd be like saying, hey, a car is plowing down the sidewalk in this neighborhood and it hit kids who were walking on the sidewalk. And your first response is, well, why were they walking on the sidewalk? Why didn't they just get over it? And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe in this sort of ideal world where you know nothing about the situation that happened, in that scenario, you can say they should have just dodged the car. But one, you don't know the circumstances. And two, why are you not more upset that the car is driving on the sidewalk to begin with? And I think that kind of addresses what Scott's third point there is, where it's like, it feels like you're trying to find the reasons to pardon or ignore or minimize the casualties coming from Israeli side because you're being told that they're the good guys. And it's like, look, what Hamas did to the Israeli people was awful and horrible and evil. And that doesn't mean that Israel gets to target civilians back either, because what that does is also evil and horrible.
One of the things I've heard a lot, and we see a lot on social media, is that, well, yeah, it's sad that the innocent or quote unquote innocent Palestinians are being killed, but are they really that innocent if they voted for Hamas to be in power in the first place? It's like, man, you really shouldn't use that argument, because then you're literally using the same argument that bin Laden used to justify killing 2,000 people on 9/11. And it's that, hey, like, you're a democracy, right? Like, if you're a democracy and then everyone has a say in what their government does, and then they must also bear responsibility for it. So then, therefore, I have the right to kill you because you killed 500,000 of my children. The logic of it kind of pans out, but it doesn't mean that it's actually ethical. And not to mention the fact that, I think it's like 40 or 50% of the Palestinians that are currently being killed right now were not old enough to vote during those elections in the first place, nor are there, 50% of them are still under the age of 18 today. So it's truly innocent people that are being slaughtered, even if you grant the premise that, like, oh, everyone that, dies and that voted for Hamas should be given those consequences. The other aspect of it that is really interesting is, like, it's like, I don't think, and to be careful of how to put this, like if let's say the Native American reservations in the United States were treated in the same way that Gaza's treated. We set up a big old wall around it. We control whether they get, food and water and power. And I'm aware that maybe in some places there's ancillary or like a little bit less direct ways that this occurs on native reservations. But just for the sake of the analogy, the native reservation that is just down the road from us here in Washington, we set up walls around them. Anyone that got within 30 feet of the line would be shot. They're not allowed to hop on their boats and go fish. It's like, yeah, that is not really a reservation anymore. That really is like a prison. And people did a lot of pushback saying they're like, oh no, Gaza's not like an open air prison. Like if they don't want to get slaughtered, they just need to move south towards Egypt. It's like, well, that's like telling these Native Americans, like, hey, if you don't want to be, slaughtered or anything, you don't like your lot in life, like just go into Canada. It's like, that's not really an answer to it. It's like, well, they're there, like Scott Horton is trying to say, they're trying to hold on to what's left of their land. The land of Israel, or that entire area prior to 1910 was, or at least up until 1910, was only 2% Israeli. It was all Palestinian. So a lot of these people, their grandparents, great grandparents, as far back as they can possibly remember, were people living there, and it was taken from them. So to them, it's like, this is their land. So, it's a very complicated situation, obviously. There should not be any simple answers to it, and especially simple answers that result in being like, well, some people just need to die, and that's that. Like that is not a sufficient reason to commit something like bombing that church or doing a lot of these other things. It might be a reality of it, but it's not. It should at least give everyone pause. And what's really unfortunate about this entire situation is people just jump to conclusions, have no pause, and the war bloodlust is just right there right away. And one of the things that's, a silver lining of this church being bombed is that some of the people that were a lot more quick to be like, yes, level Gaza, are now like, oh man, like, yeah, there are actually people there, that are not, violent, bloodthirsty monsters that are being killed and put in harm's way. I saw Charlie Kirk do a slight bit of a retraction about some of his viewpoints on Twitter, which is really good. Like, that's a good thing. And I hope that, the consequence of this awful action by the Israelis does wake a lot more people up to realize that, like, yeah, there are people over there, people like you and I that have, I just had a daughter. Like, I was telling someone that I was talking with, I was like, yeah, there are literally, 400,000 or so kids just like this little baby that I'm holding right here in Gaza. Do you really want to go flatten their entire world? It's like, no, like, think about that when you start posting these things, because that's who you're actually talking about.
Absolutely right. Yeah. Our next take's a little similar, so I think we'll...
Okay, cool. We'll save some for it. All right, our next one is, oh boy. It's by Nikki Haley, and she writes, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. What do you think, Donnie?
Just an absolutely bonkers take. I saw Spike Cohen respond. He said, "No, it isn't." And by the way, if you disagree with me, then you're an anti-Semite by this definition, because he, of course, is Jewish. This to me has highlighted the absolute, like for the past, I don't know, since 2016, let's say, about 2015, the modern Republican Party and the modern left have been very different beasts. Pre 2015, it was very easy for the libertarians or liberty people to say, oh, they're just the same. It's just the uniparty. It's all the same. They really did become something, intrinsically, not intrinsically, extrinsically different, if that's a word. And I think now, in these moments of crisis, when a big event happens like this, you can see, no, they really, at their core, when it matters most, they are the same. And, Donald Trump didn't fundamentally change the DNA of the Republican Party in the right way. He didn't change it in an ideological, we're going to turn our views into a sort of inward sense of where are we getting our principles from. He didn't change that enough, because at the core of it, what we see here is this is just identity politics. That's all this take is. And it just shows, oh, wait, identity politics is something the left pushes and the right's supposed to criticize. But now we're playing it to say, if you don't support this geopolitical specific view of Israeli supremacy and supporting them at all costs and sending all weapons and all money to them from the United States, and they are the Holy Land, then you hate all Jews because you're a bad person. That's where we've come. That is where the modern Republican Party is. And the problem is that even though even though Nikki Haley isn't like the leader of the Republican Party, and there might be pushback in the sense that you could say, oh well, Donald Trump is still crushing her in the polls, so the Republican Party has changed. I don't think so. I think that this anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is a lot more popular than she is specifically, and I think that
Hmm.
the I think the overwhelming amount of people who want to retaliate against Hamas are probably okay with this being the language over something more balanced. And to me, I think it's like if there's any part of you that says that, like, maybe I don't fully agree with it, but it's an okay sentiment, or any sort of toleration of this idea, you're ceding the ground, and you're surrendering to the woke ideology. I think you could say Israel is 100% justified in their response. You could be, we should, burn down the Gaza Strip completely, and you could still say this is a terrible, stupid take. So my hope is that we have a lot of people condemning this absolutely idiotic, moronic take, because to me, this doesn't even have to do with the specific scenario. This has to do with like the fact, feelings. It's the age of facts are over now, or what's the time of facts is over now. It's the age of feelings meme of Ben Shapiro, who's been doing the exact same thing, where this is triggered by the current event. But I don't think that you even have to have a specific perspective on the current event to disagree with this take, or agree with it, actually. But it's a horrible take, and it's horrible no matter what side you're on in terms of how Israel should respond to Hamas's attack.
Yeah, it's almost as bad as Joe Jorgensen's. It's not enough to not be racist; you must be actively anti-racist.
Exactly.
Tweet. I think to tackle from kind of another angle, I had someone ask me the other day. This is a Christian, and you and I are both Christians, and I think that a big driver of like the pro-Zionist movement, at least in America, is very much some of the Christian side of it. And Christians believe, for people that are not Christian or not familiar with like biblical worldviews and the way Christians view Israel, like there are some people, and I like, we believe that if we believe in the Bible, that Israel and the Jews are God's chosen people first, and then due to Christ's sacrifice, like now salvation and being part of the Christian faith has been opened up to all people, both Jew and Gentile. And there are prophecies in the Bible, and there are things in the Bible about Israel, like the nation of Israel returning to the land of Israel and establishing its own government. And so a lot of Christians, they kind of get hung up on this because they're like, well, like, doesn't the Bible command that Israel should be in charge of that land there? Don't they have a right to return there? And like, regardless of whether, the property rights issues and all this stuff, Israel can be criticized if you're a Christian. Like, it's okay to criticize Israel, especially on the things that they are doing bad that do not line up with what the Bible says we should act, to love justice and to love mercy and to value truth and all these different things. So when Israel, regardless of your views about how this, like you're saying, whether or not they should flatten or not flatten the Gaza Strip, or whether they should or should not retaliate, in this instance, like, look at the overall arc of how they have treated the Palestinians in that land. These people that are, by Israel's definition, they are foreigners in their land. It's like, well, the Bible obviously advocates for a lot different treatment of those types of people. It does not advocate for an apartheid state. It does not advocate to separate them and to give them second-class citizenship. So it's okay, Christians at least, to criticize Israel and to criticize, especially the government of Israel when they do things that are not moral, that do not line up with God's word. You're not in violation, or you're not, condemning God's chosen people if you say, hey, like, this is something that they're doing that is wrong. And I really appreciate, my pastor has kind of, there's a really strong urge for people to be like, we are Christians, and so we side with Israel every single time. And I appreciate my pastor saying, like, look, like, the Jews are God's oldest friends, but that doesn't mean that we need to condemn, innocent people that are also loved by God in the Gaza Strip and in other places. And so I would just advocate that, like, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you can't criticize the bad decisions or immoral decisions made by Israel, especially the government of Israel, which I think you can kind of view that as almost separate from the Jewish people.
Well, I was going to say, anyone who's read through the Old Testament, like, almost, when you look in particular in books like First and Second Kings, it's like a string of this king became king over Israel or Judah, because of course there are the multiple tribes. It's like he didn't honor God like his father David before him, and it's like a string of like didn't honor God, didn't honor God, didn't honor God. Hey, he honored God, didn't honor God, didn't honor God. It's like the majority of the kings of Israel did not honor God through their actions, through their governments. The majority of them didn't do, and then some of the ones who even did good things, it's like, he honored God as his father David, or not as his father David before him had, though. He left the high places in there, like the worshiping of the other gods, places dedicated for that. And it's like, so even if you think, well, Israel's our only democratic ally in the Middle East, and that justifies, they're doing good in that sense, and they're not, they're opposing jihad, and it's like, okay, Israel can still be doing some good things, and then still be doing bad things. They can still leave the high places up, as it were, and you can criticize that, right? The Bible does that. So, from that theological perspective, recognize that the government of Israel is very different from God's chosen people, Israel, and God's chosen people, Israel, were criticized in the Bible for its actions in government, even when they did good things. So, it's with everything, nuance and I don't know, delineation is required.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got like a quote retweet thread. First tweet is on this news story.
It's cut off, so I was going to say you don't really need to read that. I think just the quote retweet summarizes it.
So. Okay. So I'll just read the entire tweet then. So Billy Binion writes, "This story is rage-inducing. Dallas cops violently arrested an innocent man after mistaking him for a guy with a similar name. The kicker, after noticing their error, they can be heard making up bogus charges. He was jailed for days and lost his job. And the worst part is that he will face an extraordinary uphill battle just to get the privilege to state his case before a jury. Thanks to the made-up immunity doctrines our government gives its employees, the most powerful people should not be held to the lowest standard." What do you think about that take?
It's a great take. I think this is a Reason reporter, if I'm not mistaken, and he's had some stuff that I'm not a super fan of, but he's very, very good at tracking down these kinds of stories. He reports on them a lot. This one, obviously, the other individual, Kelly Smith is the one who brings up the story, so credit to her, and he's highlighting it. But he goes on it and says a couple of other remarks, but I thought these were the most pertinent. And it's the last line in particular is such a good summary, I think,
of really good
of where our current justice system is, because I think that in today's day and age, it's very easy, in particular if you live in a blue state or a blue city where crime tends to be a bigger issue, and that's not exclusively true, but it is a lot. You can have conflicting feelings, or you can just have, well, look, the cops aren't perfect, but we need them to do their job. Look at all this ridiculous stuff when you hamper them. And to that, I would say, insofar as we live in a government-controlled state where the power of the police exists, and we have to deal with that. Looking at the world around us as it is, not as we wish it would be. What we ought to at least move towards then is that last line. The most powerful people shouldn't be held to the lowest standard. And I think that the left often does this in really poor ways, and I'd love to partner with more, people on the left for good criminal justice reform. But it feels like their solution in many times is like, okay, well, in Seattle, homelessness is a big issue, and there are drugged out people on the streets. So because police violence is a thing, we're going to say you can't do anything about the drugged out people on the street who are violently attacking people. You can't really do anything. You can't really move them. You can't put them away. And it's like, so we just get the worst of all worlds. They handle things in the worst possible way. And then the right generally says we need to give them all the powers. We need to make sure that they're protected in every instance. And so, being in a blue area is tricky when you want to hold the cops to a reasonable standard, but the people around you, it's like they're saying, okay, we're tying their hands completely and letting chaos emerge, and that's the outcome. And that's not the outcome that I think a libertarian or a liberty-oriented society would want, should have. If cops have to be a thing in a sort of monarchist system, then the cops ought to have the most strict disciplinary measures. They should have, not the crazy amounts of their own police courts to get them off qualified immunity. They shouldn't have those types of things, and they should be required to hold up to the highest standards when it comes to arresting someone, to investigating someone, doing all these things. And if you don't have a state with cops, then that's what private security does, and private security is for. But the way that we currently are, I think that a lot of people on the right are hesitant to try to criticize or try to reform police because they're so hamstrung and hampered in where we are right now, where it's like, well, I don't want to say anything bad about the police because we need them. Look at all the crime going on. And it's like, you don't have to pick, the status quo or this ridiculous overpowered police area, and this overpowered police situation where they can do things like this, which is just not even get the dude's name right, ruin his life, and then that dude has almost no recourse to get it back, for doing literally nothing wrong.
Yeah, one of the things that's so awful about the police system is that it gives people permission to violate their conscience. And the example that I can think of for this, and this is in no way comparing my experience to what this poor guy encountered, but I think it's a similar type of mindset. About 2 months ago, I was driving home and a cop thought I was talking on my cell phone, on speakerphone, pulled me over, kind of baited me into it. So he was in an unmarked car going very, very slow and on the highway. And so I decided I was going to pass him. And he was trying to get a look into my car to see if I was on the phone or not. He thought I was, pulled me over, came up, accused me of being on the phone. And then he's like, well, I'm going to have to write you a ticket. I know it's really dumb. I know it's really stupid. I know it makes no sense. I know this law is silly, but it is the law and I have to enforce it. I thought, man, when I have a job that forces me to do something that I don't agree with, that I think is wrong, that I think is stupid, that I think is not effective, I either try and make my case and change it, or I don't enforce it where I don't have to enforce it. And it made me, as small and as minor as that encounter was, like, I'm obviously got off fine. I paid, instead of paying $150 to the state to pay for the ticket, I just paid $150 to Off the Record, which is a website that specializes in getting tickets off your record. It's great. You should go use it if you ever get a ticket. Give them money. Don't give the state money. But it was all good. But what was so disappointing and so scary to me is that we have someone, like this guy is saying, with so much power. In that moment, he could literally kill me and probably get away with it. He could literally do anything he wants to me in that moment, and I have to be compliant with it. And this person that has all of that power doesn't have the moral fortitude to not enforce something that he thinks is wrong. And that was just like, I was like, that is the entire 2020 issue in a nutshell. You had police officers who might generally lean conservative in some ways, might not even agree with the lockdowns or anything, still going into businesses and saying, hey, I don't agree with what the governor's saying. I don't agree with the local laws and mandates. I don't think these should happen, but it's the law. And so I'm going to enforce at gunpoint your inability, or the ability for you to not be able to provide for your family and have your business open. It's like, yeah, that literally is like the Nuremberg defense. It's like, well, they're just following orders. And that's what's so scary about it. And so then you add in, like with these guys, the human element of, oh, I made a mistake, I want to cover it up, or one of my friends made a mistake and I want to cover it up, and so I'm going to make up bogus charges. It's like, yeah, now it can kind of spiral out of control. You can see that even someone who is not like being a police officer in this system should require you to have the highest of high standards. Like I have a couple of friends who are cops, and like I try and associate and be friends with people that I think are of good moral character. They all meet like the bare minimum to me of what it should be to be a cop, and that I would trust them to be alone with my wife or my kid in a room, and that's great. Like, and I know that they wouldn't lie about it. I know that they wouldn't be tempted to do something that is wrong. I know that if they're, if potentially they could benefit or they could get away with something, they wouldn't do that. But the problem is most cops do not meet that bar. And we can see that clearly here in this example. They wanted to cover for each other. And this poor guy, because of the low standards that we now enforce upon police, which is like, well, as long as they can just say that, oh, I thought what I thought was doing was right, they can get off with it, this guy has to suffer for it.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the last thing to me is, it's like the easiest takeaway here, if you are like what's your point? To me, the easiest takeaway is, let's just get rid of the immunity doctrines, because I think everyone can recognize that that's a crazy standard to say, that just because not even just because, like, it's crazy to say that they are the only quote unquote legitimate authors of force, uninitiated, right? Through the law, through saying, hey, you're coming with me if you resist arrest, etc. And they're the ones who get immunity, not even like a higher standard of, proof, not even like a most likely guilty, not even a, like, an even higher standard than we currently have for other people. It's so many levels of immunity that they have to go through. Let's at least get over that and then move on from there, because to me that's the first thing that I don't think it's that controversial to say we could do away with, personally.
Yeah. I can't remember who said this, but they're like, you could reform the police institutions pretty quick. Like, one, do away with qualified immunity, and then two, any sort of settlements that are reached due to police officers' wrongdoing is taken out of police officer pensions. It's like it's like you could create, and I'm not saying that I want to continue to have like public policing or anything like that in an ideal anarchist libertarian society, but at least that would be more representative of a private institution, which the incentives would help employees enforce their own, right? So all of these good apples that are part of the system would now be like, hey, like anytime my buddy messes up and does something wrong, it's coming out of my pension and my buddy's pension who also does the right things. It's like they're going to enforce their own and make sure that bad apples are taken care of right away. Today, as it currently sits, when a police officer messes up and commits, some sort of wrongdoing upon a citizen, it's the citizen's taxes that pay for that police officer's wrongdoing. No one that is actually committed the wrong pays any sort of, meaningful penalty for it. It's all borne by the taxpayer, the actual victim in this scenario.
Absolutely.
All right, moving on to our last one. So we had this is kind of funny, man. This was like 5 or 6 days ago. We had someone commenting on episode 61 of our show, back when we were known as the Cringe Post podcast. And back then we were just only ever doing bad takes. So you could just think of it as the Bad Take podcast. And so we kind of had like tongue in cheek names for our YouTube videos. And this one was called, Landlords Are Parasites, which if you've listened to our show for any stretch of the of time that we've been on, you know that we are very much pro capitalism and landlords making those services available to people. So it's kind of a sarcastic way of poking at one of the takes that we were looking at on that episode. Anyways, this person I don't think watched it, and they commented, "Housing for people, not for profit." And we replied, which we also said this in the video, housing for people to live doesn't exist without profit. And then Magpunk writes, "You're right. Capitalism exploits the means of subsistence for profit. That's one reason why capitalism has to go." And then follows up with, "There's nothing voluntary about the exchange when the alternative is starvation, homelessness, and destitution. Making a decision under duress is not consent. It is coercion. Capitalism is exploitation." What do you think, Donnie, about that last one, or the entire exchange in general?
Yeah, no, I actually I like that general point, which is to say, there's nothing voluntary when the duress, when a decision is made under duress. And so to me that says, okay, so if the decision under duress is pay my taxes and give some of the things I haven't earned in order for someone else to take it, that is not a real decision. That's not voluntary. That's not there. That's not a good choice to make. And so, if the reality was that resources existed and decay was not a law of dynamics and sort of a law of nature, maybe he would have somewhat of a point. But the point is that we start from poverty. We start from nothing. We start from no resources that are even wild resources that nature makes available. You at the very minimum have to harvest, and you have to at least take care of, because in the same way that without work you're not able to build a house. Even if you were talking about like berries that grow in bushes, without work those bushes will overgrow, and those overgrown bushes will make it so that you literally can't access the berries, and you have to pick the berries in order. And most people need to survive off of things that are not just the readily available resources that naturally exist. And guess what? Not every area of the world is as habitable as others. There are areas just by their very nature that are unequal to others in terms of how habitable they are. And so all of this is to say that you need to have profit in order for there to be an abundance of things, not only in your immediate area, but in the areas that are less generous with those resources. And so, taking this person at their best, at their sort of maybe their idealistic best, they want it so that it doesn't matter where you are, who you are, what your resources are, you should have a place to live. But the best way to make that happen is by generating profit so that there is excess wealth, excess resources from areas and places that are productive and have an abundance of that kind of resources. And then they can be freely exchanged with other areas that do not have those same resources so that you can create housing. So, this person really wants the housing to be for the people, not for profit. And like, I get that. Like, if your only motivation in to create housing is profit, and you charge $1 million that they pay stuff, that's not great. We don't love that. But the system of capitalism is the one that best eliminates that level of greed. It's the one where it says, no, if you want to get more, if you want to have more things, it actually helps you to help other people.
Yes.
It helps you to spread the resources from where you have them abundantly to areas where they don't have them abundantly, and then you can exchange. And that's how the profit enables housing to be for the people. And so, greed isn't great, but greed's in every system, and no system is without greed. Capitalism is able to use greed into a way that it spreads out resources in the most fair division possible.
Yeah, I think about this example, and I'm going to journey away from Coconut Island just to log cabin, let's just say.
All right, log cabin.
For this guy. We'll go to the log cabin. You've got a fireplace in there, and you are very good at chopping wood, and you live in some cold climate. And it's like, okay, you need to chop X amount of wood every single day to heat your house. It's like, well, the only way for there to exist more for, like, let's say you have a neighbor who he doesn't own an axe or something like that. The only way for that neighbor, and maybe that neighbor is good at creating, milking the cows or using chickens or whatever. The only way for there to be a chance of exchange there, where you get eggs because you don't have chickens to produce eggs, and your neighbor gets wood in order for them to heat their house, is for you to produce more than what you currently need to exist. That is, in essence, it's profit, right? Because if you produce only what you need from the firewood standpoint, like the next day you're going to have to go produce the same amount. You don't actually produce any savings or anything like that. And then much less do you have the ability to give any or trade any away to someone, even if you want to give it to someone out of the goodness of your heart. I mean, this works even better, I guess, with something like chickens or with or like a cow or something like that. It's like you have to produce enough milk not only to meet your current daily needs, but to also continue to feed your cow so it continues along in the future. And if you don't have those things, if you have a business that makes zero profit every single year, there is eventually going to be a year where that business no longer exists, because the people that run it can no longer subsist off of whatever that business is making, because they've given everything away. And a lot of people think of landlords, and I'm not saying this is every single rental property out there, and there are definitely exceptions, and there are bad actors like BlackRock that use government action and eminent domain and various types of actual coercive mechanisms to take property unfairly, not in an actual free market aspect. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like the average landlord, which is maybe 45, 50 years old, has saved their money throughout their entire life and has purchased a rental property that they now maintain, and that they are hoping maybe in 20, 30 years they can sell and live off of whatever they've sold it for their retirement. That's the average landlord. They don't actually make a profit. So when you're paying, like here in Seattle, it's ridiculous. If you pay $2,000 a month for a house to live in, like a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house to live in, that'd be amazing if you could get that here. I don't think you can, but just for the example of it, if you pay $2,000 a month for that, that's probably just covering the mortgage for the landlord, and they are eating all the maintenance costs out of their own budget. Because most likely what happened is, for that $600,000 house that they purchased, they saved up probably 120 grand over their 20 years of working to pay for it, so they could get a 20% down payment. And your rental payment covers the mortgage, and what the value they're providing is you did not have the ability to amass the capital to guarantee to a loan or lender provider that you could sufficiently pay for that house that was built by other people. So they are using their capital to take a hold of it, and now they are renting it to you. And the exchange that occurs there is that you're covering the mortgage, they have taken on the risk, and they maintain the property. They're actually losing money. In that normal rental model, most people lose money because the amount of rent that they're collecting only covers the mortgage. It doesn't cover maintenance. It doesn't cover property taxes or anything like that. The gain that the property owner gets is that in 30 years, they can now sell that house for whatever appreciation occurred. And that's why it is an okay kind of investment. But it's a really long-term one. It requires 30 years of diligence and constantly taking care of a house. And that profit, that extra amount, let's just say that they were able to make an extra amount. Let's say that their mortgage is $1,500 a month and you're paying $2,000 a month. Let's say that they have to replace a roof on that house. Do you know how much a roof costs? It costs 15 grand to do a new roof for a house. That extra $500 that property owner has been making every month is going to go towards fixing that capital asset and preserving that value. And so if you don't want to make those decisions, if you don't have the ability to generate that type of money and make it happen, like the benefit that you get from renting is that you don't have to do that. Like another person is taking on that responsibility. And so that exchange is great. It's not exploitation. I'm not saying that in every instance it is an exploitation, but as a general principle, it is not something that is wrong. It's an actual benefit to both people. People have trade-offs. And the person that is a tenant has decided that the trade-off is, I don't want to own it. I want to just pay for rent. And the person that owns it is saying, hey, I don't have to live there. I'm going to deal with all of the problems like I do live there. And at the end of it, hopefully I've made well enough. So there's nothing wrong with, the actual pure essence of being a landlord and being a tenant. The only types of things, and like this guy's saying, is when there is coercion involved. But usually coercion is the thing that invades when you take away the free market, because now there are bad actors in the state that are supposed to be the arbiters of justice and truth to make everything fair. But more often than not, they make everything very unfair.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. The last thing I just want to say, the idea that capitalism creates exploitation through all this is it's very fascinating to me, because you have to do a lot of gymnastics, I think, in your head to say that, in a system where at the very base minimum, let's say you're working on a farm your whole life, people understand the concept of like, okay, the winter's coming, crops aren't going to grow, so we have to save food for the winter. Like that is no one looks at that and says, man, the seasons are, exploitation. Seasonal profit is exploitation, because they recognize, no, like when things don't grow in the winter, you need that excess food to survive. And then you take that to sort of a broader scale, and let's talk about someone's whole life. Like, okay, so there are going to be years when this person is going to be old and can't work the fields like they used to, and they aren't going to produce that same amount of food. And so they have to put a little bit away every single year so that they have, stores in order to survive on that. And the great thing about a free market exchange is we don't have to rely exclusively on one type of produce that's going to go bad, that doesn't get to be saved long term. Is you can trade the food for something that will last you, that has value down the road, so that by the time you aren't able to work, you can use all that extra that you saved in your over the years for food that hasn't been spoiled, and you can exchange that, and that's awesome. Before, you were way more reliant on other people taking care of you, but now you actually have this self-reliance ability, which is great. And in that self-reliance, you're actually helping more people by exchanging goods that aren't, that have different time preferences. So when you're older and you don't have the same ability to harvest food in your farm, let's say, having stored lots of food over the years wouldn't work, because it would rot and go bad. So that's why over those years you could exchange it for something like metals or something that held their value. But now in your older age, these metals don't have the same value that to someone else who could use them, and the food doesn't have the same amount of value to them as it does to you, and you exchange. And so that's wonderful. In any other system where you have a government mandating, you are exploiting people's current labor to pay for people who no longer can work, and the people don't get a say. You don't have any kind of say as to how much you get or how much you give. To me, that seems, both systems create a scenario in which the sort of the end goal is for a person who has access to resources of a specific kind transfers those resources to people who can't get those and need them. That's kind of the end goal of both of these systems. The difference is one exploits people without their consent. The other one allows people to exchange based on their own preferences, their own values, and however much they wanted to put in their effort. And this applies to housing as well. So I think you were talking about the housing much better than I could add anything else on there. But I just wanted to tackle this last bit because, they kind of go into how capitalism is exploitation and that's why it's got to go. But to me, when you're talking about exploitation and in particular, you're talking about, resource allocation and that applies to things like housing and needs that people have, it's crazy to me that you would think that there's a system that uses force under threat of duress of, being frankly, violent in a socialist system, under threat of violence, being thrown in a cage if you don't cooperate or don't pay. And that's somehow less exploitative than a system where people can choose to work harder to earn more at the time, to have more for later, or they can choose to take it easier now and have less in the future. They can choose to exchange for what they want now or what they'll need later. All of that is under much more voluntary terms than a system that literally exploits you against your will to say, we'll take care of you in the future on other people's exploitation, and you don't get a say as to how that comes out. I don't know. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And again, like we offered to Mage Punk or
Mage Punk, probably.
Mage Punk 2376. We offered he could, or she or he or whoever could come on the podcast to talk it through. We are happily also extending that again on this. So Mage Punk, come on, we'll hang and discuss. And I think we're pretty friendly, Donnie. Like I don't think we'd be mean or anything, but we would defend our position, very with a lot of effort. So just come prepared, I suppose.
I'm sure you're a great person. Let's talk it out and make your ideas even greater than they are.
Oh, there you go. Awesome. Well, friends, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll catch you on the next one.